lately we've been focused on England.
Yeah.
Like thinking about Thomas Cromwell's last moments and
Right.
how he, turned back to the faith and
Yeah.
the harm that he did during the dissolution of the monasteries.
Absolutely.
But today,
Hmm.
I thought we'd go to France
Okay.
and look at the story of St. Joan of Arc.
It's a pretty inspiring one, I think, particularly for people who understand the power of faith in action.
Yeah, it is.
You have this,
A teenage girl leading an army.
right, a young, uneducated peasant girl who believes so deeply in the guidance that she's receiving that she rallies a demoralized nation.
Right.
And she leads them to these remarkable victories.
It is.
It really is a testament to what faith can achieve.
Yeah, impossible odds.
Seemingly impossible odds.
And that's why I think, for our deep dive today,
right.
we're going to immerse ourselves in Andrew Lang's The Story of Joan of Arc.
Hmm.
And what makes Lang's account so valuable is that it's grounded in historical evidence.
Yeah.
Including, the trial transcripts
Oh, well.
of her adversaries.
That's important, right?
Yeah.
Because we're not just relying on folklore.
Right.
Lang really meticulously examines the contemporary records.
Right.
The testimonies of the people that were there.
Yeah.
And so we're going to be able to look at what was going on in the 15th century in France.
Okay.
So let's set the scene a little bit.
Okay, so
A kingdom.
what was France like in the 15th century?
A kingdom fractured under immense pressure.
Yeah.
The English had made significant inroads.
Right.
And a powerful French faction, the Duchy of Burgundy, had allied itself with them.
Oh, wow.
And so there's this deep internal division, and we have the Dauphin Charles, the uncrowned heir to the French throne, in a really tough spot.
Right, and the coronation was an important element to
Oh, it was vital.
establishing
Yeah,
his legitimacy.
It's the traditional coronation of French monarchs, and it takes place at the Cathedral of Reims,
Right.
where they're anointed with sacred oil,
Okay.
believed to have heavenly origins.
Wow.
And so this ceremony was vital
Yeah.
for establishing that divine right of kings.
Right.
The challenge was that Reims was under English control,
Oh.
effectively preventing the Dauphin's coronation
Right.
and weakening his claim in the eyes of many.
Right.
This is the desperate situation into which John steps forward.
So we have this, backdrop of war and a contested throne.
Yes.
And then you have this young girl living in the village of Domremy.
Yeah.
So tell us about her early life.
She was born about 1412 into a poor but deeply devout peasant family.
Right.
And she never learned to read or write,
Okay.
nor did she have any experience with warfare.
Okay.
However, all accounts emphasize her profound piety from a very young age.
Right.
She was known for her devotion to prayer, her solitary times in church, her compassion for the poor,
Right.
and her regular participation in the Holy Mass.
And it was in this context that she first starts to experience
She starts to hear voices,
the voices, right?
accompanied by a radiant light, around the age of 13 in her father's garden.
Wow.
And she identifies these voices as being St. Michael, St. Catherine, and St. Margaret,
Right.
these revered saints in the Catholic tradition.
Right.
And these voices instructed her to live a virtuous life, to remain close to the church, and most significantly,
Yeah.
to go and deliver France from English domination.
Imagine, the impact of that on a young girl.
Oh my gosh.
Overwhelming, right?
Completely overwhelming. How did she respond to that?
She felt overwhelmed and inadequate.
Right.
She herself stated, I'm just a poor girl, unskilled in warfare and leadership.
Right.
The task must have seemed insurmountable.
Right.
And so for several years, she kept these divine encounters private, perhaps grappling with their meaning
Right.
and fearing disbelief or mockery
Right.
from those around her. But as the situation in France gets worse,
Oh, yeah.
the voices persist,
They
right?
persist and they urge her to act.
Right. So how did she transition from these private revelations
Mm-hmm.
to taking tangible steps towards her mission?
The siege of Orleans by the English in 1428 proves to be a crucial catalyst.
Okay.
Orleans held immense strategic importance.
Right.
For the Dauphin, it controlled access to the southern territories,
Right.
still loyal to him.
Right.
And its fall would have been a devastating blow.
Right.
The Dauphin himself, facing this critical threat and still uncertain of his legitimacy,
Right.
was in a state of despair.
Yeah.
And it was in this dire context that the voices became more insistent,
Okay.
commanding Joan to seek out Robert de Baudricourt, the commander of the fortified town of Vaucouleurs.
Okay.
And her message, dictated by the voices, was clear.
Okay.
She was to request safe passage to the Dauphin in Crinon, bearing the divine assurance
Wow.
that she would liberate France.
So she goes to Baudricourt,
She does.
who's a seasoned military man.
Yes.
And he meets this young peasant girl
Yeah, what credence would a hardened soldier give to this?
with a lot of skepticism.
You're this young girl,
Yeah.
claiming divine guidance.
Right.
However, an extraordinary event occurred shortly after her arrival in Vaucouleurs in February 1429.
Okay.
Joan spoke of a significant French defeat near Orleans that had taken place on February 12th,
Okay.
the Battle of Rouvray,
Okay.
also known as the Battle of the Herrings.
Right.
And remarkably, news of this defeat had not yet reached Vaucouleurs
Wow.
because of the distance and the dangers of travel.
So she knew about something
Yes, she had knowledge of an event
before it was even reported.
before it was officially reported.
That's incredible.
It really impacted Baudricourt,
Yeah.
suggesting that there was indeed something extraordinary about this young woman.
Yeah.
While he didn't immediately grant her request,
Okay.
the accuracy of her information clearly made a deep impression.
Wow.
And it just highlights that sometimes the most compelling evidence
Right.
comes in ways that defy conventional explanation,
Right.
pointing towards a power beyond the ordinary.
So Baudricourt eventually does decide to support her mission.
He does.
He gives her an escort.
Yes, after some initial hesitation.
Right.
And perhaps prayerful consideration.
Right.
Baudricourt eventually provides Joan with an escort of 2 gentlemen and several men-at-arms for protection, as well as a horse.
Wow.
And it's noteworthy that despite her lack of prior experience, she rode with surprising skill. And it was also at this time that she adopted male attire, a practice she maintained throughout her public life.
Okay.
And before reaching the Dauphin, she makes a significant pilgrimage to the chapel of St. Catherine at Fierbois.
Now, what's the significance of that chapel?
St. Catherine of Fierbois held a special reverence, particularly among soldiers, both French and Scots.
Okay.
And a local legend recounts the miraculous survival of a Scottish archer named Michael Hamilton, who was said to have been hanged but lived after praying to St. Catherine.
Oh, wow.
So this speaks to the strong current of faith
Yeah.
and belief in divine intervention that permeated the era
Right.
and undoubtedly influenced Joan's own journey.
So she attends 3 masses at Fierbois.
Yes.
Okay.
And dictates a letter to the Dauphin announcing her imminent arrival,
Wow.
showing remarkable foresight.
Right.
She also writes to her parents seeking their forgiveness for leaving without their permission.
Wow.
Aware of the potential dangers she faced and the possibility that she might never see her mother again.
So she arrives at Chinon to meet the Dauphin.
She does.
And this must be a very charged moment.
It was.
Full of anticipation.
It was upon entering the Grand Hall at Chinon, filled with these elaborately dressed courtiers, Joan immediately identifies the Dauphin Charles, who had deliberately dressed in simpler attire to test her.
Oh, wow.
She knelt before him and declared, "Fair sir, you are the Dauphin to whom I am come."
So she immediately recognizes him.
Yes, this immediate and accurate recognition, despite never having seen him before,
Oh, wow.
served as the first powerful confirmation for him and his court.
But I'm sure the Dauphin was still, cautious
Absolutely.
in that moment.
To further discern the authenticity of her claims,
Right.
the Dauphin takes Joan aside for a private conversation.
Okay.
Now, the details of this exchange remained Joan's closely guarded secret,
Wow.
but its impact on the Dauphin was profound.
Huh.
Years later, he revealed that Joan had reminded him of a silent prayer he was offered in solitude,
Okay.
asking for a divine sign
Right.
to confirm him legitimacy as the rightful heir to the French throne.
So she revealed to him his own prayer?
His own private plea back to him.
That's amazing.
This deeply personal and accurate revelation convinced the Dauphin
Yeah.
of the authenticity of her divine mission.
Wow.
However, to satisfy his advisors,
Right.
and for further scrutiny,
Right?
Joan was sent to Poitiers
Okay.
to undergo rigorous examination by a panel of learned priests and lawyers.
Okay.
They questioned her extensively for 6 long weeks,
Wow.
probing her beliefs and seeking any inconsistencies in her accounts of the voices.
And how did she do under that scrutiny?
Remarkably well.
Yeah.
She answered their complex theological and legal questions with a disarming simplicity and unwavering faith, always referring back to the guidance of her voices. When pressed to perform a miracle as proof of her divine mission,
Right.
she humbly refused,
Okay.
stating that her sign would be the liberation of Orleans. She emphasized that she herself possessed no miraculous powers.
Right.
Her role was to faithfully execute the mission entrusted to her by God.
So what was the ultimate conclusion of these examiners after weeks of questioning?
Their report was significant, albeit cautiously worded.
Okay.
While they couldn't definitively pronounce on the nature of her spirits,
Right.
whether they were truly divine,
Right.
they concluded that given the desperate circumstances facing France and Joan's unwavering conviction,
Okay.
to reject her mission would be to risk resisting the Holy Spirit.
Wow.
This assessment, influenced in part by a fear of opposing a potentially divine will, ultimately paved the way for the Dauphin to finally assemble an army and allow Joan to march with them to the besieged city of Orleans.
Wow.
That's a huge moment.
Yeah, it is a huge moment.
It is.
So with the Dauphin's support and this cautious endorsement from the theologians,
Yeah.
she makes her way to Orleans.
She does.
What was the situation like when she arrived?
The morale of the French troops was at an alarmingly low ebb.
Okay.
Years of demoralizing defeats had eroded their confidence to the point where even experienced commanders like Dunois conceded that a small English force could easily rout a much larger French contingent.
Oh, wow.
But Joan's arrival on April 29, 1429, bringing much-needed supplies and radiating an unwavering belief in imminent victory,
Right.
had an immediate and profound impact on the city's atmosphere. Dunois himself observed a tangible change in the courage and resolve of the French soldiers.
And her military strategy was quite unorthodox.
It was absolutely.
She goes against the advice of these
Seasoned
commanders.
Contrary to the council of experienced military leaders who advocated for a more cautious, defensive approach,
Right.
Joan insisted on launching direct assaults against the English fortifications surrounding Orleans.
Wow.
Her unwavering conviction was that God would grant them victory if they acted boldly and with faith.
So her first target is the English fortress of St. Loup,
Yes.
which the French successfully captured under her leadership.
Correct.
Okay.
And notably, Joan displayed remarkable compassion even for the defeated English soldiers, offering comfort to a wounded prisoner.
That's amazing.
A testament to her Christian charity.
But the most significant and dramatic assault
It was
on Les Tourelles,
Yes.
the strongest English fort guarding the crucial bridge over the Loire.
Yes, this was a fierce and decisive engagement.
And she was wounded in this battle.
During the assault, Joan fulfilled her own prophecy by being struck by a crossbow bolt
Oh, wow.
between her collarbone and shoulder.
Wow.
Despite the severe pain and the suggestion of magical healing, which she firmly rejected,
Okay.
she insisted on returning to the thick of the fighting.
Oh, my gosh.
It's said that she rallied the disheartened troops by seizing her banner emblazoned with the fleur-de-lis and the names of Jesus and Mary and charging forward.
Wow.
Legend recounts that as she held her banner aloft,
Right.
the wind miraculously shifted, blowing its fringe directly against the wall of Les Tourelles.
Wow.
A powerful visual sign that inspired the final decisive French assault.
Oh, wow.
The English forces were routed, their commander Glasdale perished in the Loire River,
Wow.
and Joan triumphantly returned to Orleans across the partially repaired bridge, just as she had foretold.
Wow.
So,
Incredible.
faith when coupled with courageous action
Yeah.
can indeed move mountains.
The siege was lifted
It was
in a matter of days.
in just 4 days of intense fighting.
It must have seemed like a miracle.
Joan had effectively reduced 7 long months of English siege.
Wow.
The English forces retreated, and Orleans was liberated on May 8th.
This is a huge turning point.
It was a monumental turning point in the 100 Years' War, not only relieving a critical city, but also resoundingly restoring French morale and demonstrating the potent power of unwavering faith
Right.
and divinely inspired leadership.
And now she sets her sights on taking the Dauphin to Reims
Yes.
for his coronation.
Yes, for Joan, the liberation of Orleans was merely the imminent step.
Right.
In fulfilling her divine mission,
Right.
she recognized the profound symbolic and spiritual significance of a proper coronation in Reims
Right.
with the sacred oil.
Right.
However, the Dauphin and his advisors remained hesitant, citing the considerable danger of traversing territory still heavily contested by the English and their Burgundian allies.
But she was convinced this was God's will.
She urged the Dauphin to put aside his cautious deliberations
Right.
and to proceed to Reims to receive his crown.
Okay.
Despite the perceived risks, Joan confidently predicted that the towns and fortifications along their route would yield without significant resistance.
And that's largely what happened.
That is largely what transpired. Town after town submitted as the royal procession made its way towards Reims. Even the strategically important and heavily fortified city of Troyes fell after Joan's determined efforts in rallying the besieging French forces.
So on July 17th, 1429, the Dauphin was crowned King Charles VII.
He was.
In the Cathedral of Reims.
Yes.
With Joan standing right by his side.
With her banner held high.
I mean, this was just such a
sacred culmination
and triumphant moment
of her mission.
It was for Joan, it represented the tangible realization of God's will.
And she sees her father there.
Tears of joy streamed down her face
Wow.
within the cathedral.
Oh,
Even the assembled nobles were deeply moved by the solemnity of the occasion
right,
and the extraordinary role this young woman had played.
right.
In a touching moment, Joan recognized her father among the crowd, their first and last meeting since she had departed Domremy.
Wow.
And when the king offered her a reward for her service,
Right.
she humbly requested that her village of Domremy be granted exemption from taxes,
That's incredible.
which they enjoyed for the next 3 centuries.
Wow. A lasting testament to the impact of this simple yet divinely guided young woman.
But sadly, after this glorious moment, her story takes a tragic turn
Tragically, yes.
and is still full of conflict and ultimately betrayal.
Despite Joan's strategic counsel to capitalize on their momentum
Hmm.
and march directly on Paris, the king and his advisors hesitated,
Okay.
engaging in ultimately fruitless negotiations with the Duke of Burgundy.
Right.
And when Joan eventually led an assault on Paris, it proved unsuccessful,
Okay.
and she herself was wounded.
And so the king decides to withdraw,
He does.
much to Joan's disappointment.
Much to her disappointment.
Yeah.
So it reveals that even after experiencing divine intervention, human indecision and political maneuvering can still obstruct the fulfillment of God's greater purpose.
But she continues to fight for the liberation of other French towns.
She does, displaying her characteristic courage
Yeah.
and unwavering determination.
But the leadership just didn't have that same...
That same decisive spirit that animated
Wow.
Joan. Around this time, she encounters a woman claiming to have divine visions.
Okay.
But Joan, grounded in the authenticity of her own experiences,
Right.
was skeptical of claims that didn't translate into meaningful action.
Right.
And sadly, around this period, the voices begin to foretell her impending capture,
Oh.
which tragically came to pass at Compiègne.
Right. And she was very fond of Compiègne.
Deep affection for Compiègne.
Yeah.
Yes, in May 1430, while actively participating in the defense of the town,
Right.
Joan was captured during a sortie. Refusing to surrender, she declared her allegiance to God alone.
Wow.
And she was subsequently sold by Jean de Luxembourg to the English, who recognized a strategic opportunity to undermine both her and King Charles by portraying her as a heretic and a witch.
So then follows this infamous trial in Rouen.
Yes, it was a travesty.
It was a complete, perversion of justice.
The trial was orchestrated by the Inquisition under the authority of Bishop Pierre Cochon,
Right.
a French cleric who was vehemently partisan to the English cause.
Right.
The entire process was inherently biased and unfair.
Yeah.
Joan was denied legal counsel, subjected to relentless pressure to recant her claims about the voices, and interrogated without respite.
And yet,
Yet,
her faith remained just unshakable.
unshakable. Her wisdom often surpassed that of her learned inquisitors.
Right.
Even under the threat of torture, she refused to deny the guidance of her voices or divulge the secret prayer of the king.
Wow.
Remarkably, she even prophesied that the English would be expelled from France within 7 years, a prediction that history ultimately confirmed.
Oh, wow.
And her appeals to the Pope and the Council of Basel were suppressed,
Oh, wow.
highlighting how earthly powers can conspire against even the most divinely inspired individuals.
Yeah, and despite her unwavering faith and remarkable courage, she was condemned.
Through deceit and manipulation, she was tricked into signing a document of recantation,
Okay.
seemingly agreeing to submit to the church and to adopt female attire.
Right.
However, Cauchon betrayed this agreement. She was not granted the promised lenient imprisonment.
Okay.
And through further manipulation,
Right.
she was led to resist wearing male attire,
Right.
providing the pretext for her to be declared a relaxed heretic,
Right.
a capital offense.
Wow.
So this tragic sequence of events reveals a sobering truth
Yeah.
about the capacity for betrayal and the abuse of power, even within religious institutions.
So she's led to the stake
She is
in Rouen,
on May 30, 1431.
and her final moments must have been just unimaginable.
Yet even in those final hours, her faith remained her anchor.
Yeah.
As she was led to the stake in Rouen, she requested that a cross be held before her eyes and continuously invoked the name of Jesus.
Wow.
Witnesses recount that even some among the English observers recognized the profound injustice of her faith.
Wow.
As the flames engulfed her, her final word was said to be Jesus.
Her martyrdom is just such a powerful image.
It serves as a powerful reminder of the ultimate sacrifice made by those who remain steadfast in their faith, even unto death.
And as she had prophesied, the English did lose their hold on French territories.
The flames that consumed Joan did not extinguish the spirit of French resistance.
Yeah.
Over the subsequent 2 decades, the English were gradually driven out of France.
Wow.
And 20 years after her martyrdom, Charles VII, finally secure upon his throne, initiated a second trial to formally clear her name.
And that second trial, really affirmed her innocence?
It was a significant act of historical rectification.
Right.
Numerous witnesses, including those who had known her intimately, testified to her virtuous character,
Right.
her profound piety, and her unwavering bravery.
Right.
The court ultimately declared the first trial unlawful and unjust, formally annulling her condemnation and ordering a cross to be erected in her memory at the site of her martyrdom.
Wow.
So the second trial underscores the enduring power of truth and the eventual triumph of justice even after years of darkness.
So from humble village girl to divinely inspired military leader and ultimately a martyr for her faith and her nation,
Yes,
the life of St. Joan of Arc is truly extraordinary.
it is.
And her story just continues to inspire faith and courage centuries later.
It does. The annual processions in Orleans, the countless statues erected in her honor throughout France, her permanent place as a revered saint in the Catholic Church,
Right.
and a national heroine,
Right.
all speak to her enduring legacy of unwavering faith, incredible courage, and profound patriotism.
Right.
And even the intriguing episode of a false maid who emerged years later claiming to be Joan
Right.
only serves to highlight the indelible mark left by the true Maid of Orleans
Yeah.
and the profound impact of her life and martyrdom.
So as we conclude our deep dive into the truly remarkable life of St. Joan of Arc, we are left contemplating this story that defies easy explanation,
Yeah.
a testament to the extraordinary power of faith and conviction in the face of seemingly impossible odds.
What's so compelling here is how the story of this simple peasant girl, so deeply connected to her faith and convinced of her divine mission, could so profoundly alter the course of history.
Yeah.
And it raises this powerful question for you. Consider the sheer force of belief rooted in a depth connection to God,
Yeah.
and its capacity to shape not only individual lives but the destiny of nations.
Right.
What aspects of Joan's unwavering faith and courageous actions resonate most deeply with you?
Yeah.
Perhaps this exploration will encourage you to delve further into the historical context of her life and the profound spiritual convictions that fueled her extraordinary journey and ultimate sacrifice.